Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art, and today we'll be creating a Matisse-inspired gel plate print. So here I have a few examples of what we'll be creating today. So these Matisse-inspired prints are made with a gel plate, paint, some paper stencils, as well as some texture plates. So Matisse is a very well-known artist, and you can tell his style by lots of his organic forms, as well as human figures that he uses in his work, as well as really nice bright colors. So we'll be emulating some of the shapes that he uses in his work in our print. So for this task, you will need a gel plate. So the first thing that you're going to want to do with your gel plate is play with it a little bit, but don't be too harsh with it. It's pretty durable, but don't try and pull it in too many directions and keep sharp objects away from it. It is a silicone rubber plate, which is used for printmaking, and the reason why this is very popular for printmaking is because you can press details into it. So any tiny line, or even if you're using leaves or feathers, you'll get every single detail out of the gel plate that's pressed into it. So to begin, what we're going to do is use our texture plates to create a background. So if we have a look at these prints, we've got a mixture of positive and negative space stencils, which I'll show you how to use a bit later, but we've got our texture in the background of both of these prints, which we'll be creating as our first layer. So I've got some texture plates here. If you don't have texture plates, you can find other things that have texture, like bubble wrap works very well, or you can even use things like I mentioned before, leaves and feathers, to press into the plate to get the texture from those. So we've got some acrylic paint here. Now when you're doing your prints, it's nice to have a contrast between colors. So I've got my primary colors here. So what I'll do is just apply a little bit of paint, and it's always better to do a little bit of paint than too much paint, because you can always add the paint on very easily, but when you want to take paint away, it gets a little bit more messy. So our acrylic paint on the plate, and then our hard roller to spread that evenly across the gel plate. Now, a good tip when you are applying your paint is to make the roller go the same way instead of rolling back and forth, because this will help the paint spread a bit easier. So make sure you have a nice even layer. If the room temperature is quite warm, you'll probably want to work quite quickly so that the paint doesn't dry on your plate, but you have your texture plate, line it up as best you can, press it down with a nice even pressure. Remove it, and you should be able to see some of those details in your plate. Now I've got a few different pieces of paper here, but I've got a nice about 130 GSM, which our good prints will be on. And I've also got some copy paper, which we're going to use to clean off the plate. So have some nice vinyl display paper and some cheaper paper with you. So as you can see, that's removed pretty much all of the paint, and I've got my texture plate texture on this page. I'm going to leave that to the side just so that can dry, because we're going to be making a positive and a negative space print, so we're going to have two prints at the end. I'm just going to clean my roller and my plate with this copy paper. So this is really great way of cleaning your gel plate and your roller, because you don't have to soak anything or use water, and then you can use some of these papers again later if you're doing collage work. So you've got some nice handmade paper for later. Now I'm going to use my second texture plate, because we are making two prints. I'm going to try a different color, some yellow, and again, not too much paint, so we don't want to overload the plate. And when you are using acrylic paints, it's good to have a decent quality acrylic. If you're using something that's cheap and watery, you'll notice it's hard to roll on your gel plate to begin with, and your prints will come out very transparent. So try and get a decent quality paint. I'm using a chromacryl paint for this, which works quite nicely. Make sure you roll out any of those lines, because they will come out in the print. And our next texture plate, even pressure. and remove. Good piece of cartridge. And could have lined that up better, but that's okay. And then we have our next texture, which I will put over with my other one to dry a little bit. What you'll notice when you're using the gel plates that the paint will dry quite quickly because it's such a thin layer of paint. So you don't have to wait too long for drying times when you're going to your next layer. So we've cleaned off our roller, cleaned off our gel plate. Now we're going to move on to our stencils. So here I've got a few pre-cut stencils, which you can tell I've used before. So I've got some Matisse inspired shapes. So if you look at his work as a reference, you'll see they're very organic. They look like almost sea creatures or flowers, and he uses quite a few human figures in his work as well. So have a chat to your students about the kinds of shapes that they see and what they think might represent his work. And we've also got our negative space stencils. So we've got our positive space stencils, negative space stencils. So the difference between these, so these stencils were done with our negative space stencil, and this look was done with our positive space stencil. So it's a bit hard to describe to your students what the difference between positive and negative space will look like before they've done a print, but you'll see it come to life once you have a bit of a play. So to create these stencils, I've used some brown craft card. The reason that I've used this is because it's got a good thickness, which means that you can use these stencils over and over and over again. So even if you did this as a whole class collaboration where you all just go for a lesson of making your own shapes that everyone can use, then that's a really good way of making a stencil that's not going to rip. So to make my stencil, I'll do a very quick one for you, but you can easily spend a whole lesson doing something like this. So a Matisse inspired shape, I'm going to go for something nice and rounded. If you wanted to do a symmetrical shape, then you can fold the paper in half and then cut from the middle. But for this one, I've drawn my shape. I will cut around it, and then I'm going to cut one line into that shape and then cut all the way around it. So as you can see, I've got my positive and my negative space stencil, and we can use that for quite a few prints without worrying about it breaking. Now back to our gel plate, and I've got my two background pieces. I think we'll start with our positive shapes. So what I'm going to do is pick out a few of these shapes to have a bit of a play with before I roll my paint down, because as I mentioned before, when you roll your paint down, you don't want it sitting for too long or it will dry on the gel plate. And we've already got our background ready to go, so we don't want it drying for too long. So maybe if I do something like this guy, and he wants the star, and I'm making a story as I go. Yeah, he looks like he really wants whatever that is. You can have another star there. You can cut this out, it's fine. Okay, so once you've had a bit of a play with your composition, you figured out which shapes you want to use, we will remove those. So if you want to take a picture and then have that as a reference, then you can do that as well, but this is pretty simple, so you shouldn't need too much of a reference. Now I'm going to use my yellow layer, so I want a colour that's going to contrast, so I'll use my blue, And what's great about these gel plates and the paint is that if you want your paint to be transparent and to see those textures coming from underneath that layer of blue, then you can just use the blue as is, or if you want it to be more opaque, you can add white and that will block out the texture coming through on your top print. So this will be a bit of a light blue, but it'll have a much higher opacity than just using the plain blue. So you can mix your colours directly on the plate and then put your stencils down. So try not to touch the plate as you're placing down your pieces because your fingerprints will come out on your print. Just push those down lightly and try and line up your background print the best you can. Just apply nice, even pressure and try to get your fingers around those stencils so you don't leave any gaps. Okay, so once you think you've applied enough pressure, we'll peel that back. And as you can see, we've got our little cardboard stencils that have blocked out that area so you can see your texture plates coming out from underneath. Now I'll remove these, and just for fun we are going to take another print because there's still quite a bit of paint left on this plate. So I'm just going to use my copy paper and I'll clean off my roller at the same time. Even that looks pretty cool. So what's also really fun about gel printing is sometimes you don't know exactly what you're going to get, and the second print can sometimes look much nicer than the first one. But I'll leave these two to the side to dry, and then we're going to use our negative space stencils over the top of our blue texture plate. So again, I need a color that's going to contrast with that blue. So I'll use the red. Ow! It hurts. Ah, got it. Now I'm just going to pick out some of my stencils to use. Now if you did want to use a few different colors on this print like I have done with this, then what I would do is place one of my stencils down and then mask the area around it with some normal cover paper and then take prints as you go. But to make this a bit quicker and just to have the ease of some very simple stencils, I'm just going to use a few of these and place them around the plate to make a one color print. So you will need to use some fairly small stencils if you want to fit multiple shapes in the one composition. Oh no. Now I've just put my finger in this, so I'm just going to roll a little bit of paint to even that out. And as you can see, we've got a few sections that aren't covered. Now you don't want to print with that uncovered because you'll get weird lines and streaks over your print. So I'm just going to cut down some sections of this copy paper and mask that area with my copy paper. Now I've got my next print, and I've noticed I've got a little bit of a gap there. So what I'll do is I'll fill that and show you how to create a different color on this negative space print. So choose your color. I'm thinking a nice bright yellow. And because we're only filling in a small section, I'm not going to cover my whole plate with paint. I'm just going to cover a small section at the bottom. Now, it doesn't matter too much where you're placing this stencil on the plate because we're going to move our print to suit where it sits, but we do need to mask off these extra areas. So using a new piece of paper, and I'll use this one, so then we don't risk getting paint anywhere we don't want it to be. Now you do have to measure it out a little bit depending on where you want it to go. So just have a look at where it's sitting and place your paper down, and hopefully it's where you want it to be, but you can't be too precise. And we remove that. And there we have our little star right in the middle of our composition. Now, we clean this off. You don't have to record this part. Okay, so if you want to clean off the rest of your plate, just roll away that excess paint on your roller, use your copy paper, put it down, and just give it another roll. And that should remove pretty much all of the paint that was left on there. If you want to, you can give it a wipe down just with a cloth, and using paper to get the excess paint off will clean your plate pretty well. So we can put that to the side and have a look at our two prints. So here we've got our two Matisse inspired prints. We've used our positive space stencils for this print, and we've used our negative space stencils for this print. Now you can obviously do multiple colors using the negative space, or you can even create a gradient on your gel plate of color with these positive space prints. So lots of things you can do with the gel plates, from using found objects to create some of these textures, or using stencils if they're handmade, or ones that are already made, you can use those as well as your background. But there's lots of possibilities. You can explore different artists, you can explore different shapes. This is just one of the many things that you can do with the gel plates. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.